Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Brian and Melissa had been married for 5 years. They worked in different offices, but their routines were almost mirrored. They woke up early, prepared themselves in silence, shared breakfast between the clinking of cups and cell phone notifications. They left home almost at the same time and only saw each other again at the end of the day, tired, exhausted from meetings and deadlines. When there was still energy, they ordered food through an app or went out to dinner at a familiar restaurant. Occasionally, they would walk together in the park near their house. It was all organized, functional, predictable. There were no fights, nor big declarations. The marriage looked intact from the outside, but the wear and tear inside was almost invisible. Melissa began to notice this before Brian did. Not because of some tragedy or major flaw, but due to the absence of strong feelings. The routine felt like a corridor without windows. Everything stayed the same for so long that she couldn't even tell if there was still passion. During breakfast one Tuesday, while he fiddled with his phone and drank coffee distractedly, she put down her utensils and stared at the table. Without raising her voice, she said, "We've become a schedule couple. Home, work, food, and bed. Occasionally the park, when we have patience left." Brian looked up, surprised by her direct tone. He said they were just busy, like any adult couple. She replied that she was tired of using work as an excuse. She needed to get out, to live something different, even if it was just for a few days. Brian didn't argue much. He knew, deep down, she was right. In the following days, the atmosphere between them became more silent, but not in a calm way. It was a pause between one breath and the next. During a conversation on the couch, Melissa suggested a trip. Something unusual. "Let's go to Europe. Just us two. No email, no clock, no control." Brian hesitated. Not because of the place, but because of the impact of it. He still believed that a good night's sleep and a few more dinners would make everything return to what it was before. But she wanted more than that. She wanted to escape the routine, to experience something that would break that suffocating linearity. After thinking about it for a few days, he agreed. It was a chance to reclaim what they had been losing without realizing it. So a few weeks later, both took time off and went together. They left their phones on airplane mode and boarded heading toward Spain. They avoided the big cities and chose a secluded coastal village, one of those that seem hidden from the world. She wanted the new, the unexpected. He went because he still believed he loved that woman and wanted to understand where everything had started to slip away. In the first few days, they walked the narrow streets, ate typical foods, took photos, and laughed at silly things. Melissa seemed lighter. Brian tried to keep up with her pace, but inside he still carried the doubt of whether this trip was a fresh start, or a disguised goodbye. On the third day of the trip, after lunch by the sea, Melissa mentioned wanting to do something different. It wasn't just walking around town, taking pictures, or trying local cuisine. She wanted to see the real ocean, not the touristy kind everyone knows. She wanted something unique, something that felt like a well-kept secret. As she spoke, her eyes filled with anticipation, as if she was testing Brian to see if he'd jump on board with the idea. He looked at her and, even without fully understanding what she was looking for, said he'd go along with anything she wanted to do. A little while later, they hired a local guide named Santiago, who had his own boat and offered tours to the smaller islands and the more hidden beaches. He was friendly, spoke English with a heavy accent, but made an effort to please the couple. When Melissa asked which was the most beautiful beach, he paused before answering. Then, he said there was a secluded cove known only to locals and a few curious tourists. He said access was difficult by land, but easy by boat. He assured it was a quiet place, without commercial infrastructure, surrounded by nature and almost always empty. Melissa's eyes lit up. Brian simply nodded, thinking it would be just another tour. The next day, right after lunch, they boarded the boat. During the journey, Santiago told stories about the region and pointed out interesting spots in the landscape. Melissa listened attentively, excited. Brian observed everything, but still felt a distance between them, as if she was on a different frequency. After some time sailing, the boat stopped in a part of the coast further away. Santiago pointed to a trail leading to the beach. They got off together, walked for a few minutes until the sound of the waves grew louder. When they came out of the trail and arrived at the strip of sand, the first thing Brian noticed was the absence of clothes on the people. A couple was lying in the sun, completely naked. Further ahead, a group was chatting calmly, also without clothes. Brian looked around, confused. He asked in a low voice if that was a nudist beach. Santiago smiled and answered that it wasn't a rule, that everyone did what they felt comfortable doing. He said that there, no one cared, and mutual respect was understood. He said that Brian could feel free to do whatever he wanted. Melissa didn't think twice. She took off all her clothes and felt very comfortable. Brian, shocked, asked what she was doing. She, with a light and teasing tone, replied that the guide had been clear. She said she wanted to feel the freedom of that place. Brian stood frozen, disoriented, while his wife walked toward the sand as if she had left behind not just her clothes, but also any barriers that still connected her to the life they had shared. He remained dressed, trying to process everything. Santiago, noticing the discomfort, discreetly stepped back and left them alone. Brian walked over to Melissa and tried to talk, but she interrupted him. She said he was exaggerating, that it was just a body. Brian couldn't understand how she felt so comfortable with all of that. He questioned why she needed to expose herself like that, there, in front of a stranger and other men. She replied that she was tired of having to fit into limits that weren't even hers. She said she felt alive, and that for the first time in a long time, she felt exactly where she wanted to be. Melissa's words hurt more than Brian wanted to admit. He said he wouldn't accept that and that he would leave. She shrugged, without arguing. She just said she wanted to enjoy the moment. Brian returned to the boat, feeling a mix of anger, frustration, and disbelief. As he approached the boat, Santiago noticed he was alone. He asked if everything was okay. Brian didn't respond immediately. He just got on the boat and stared at the sea, as if trying to find an explanation for what was happening somewhere on the horizon. The silence between the two was filled only by the sound of the waves and the wind. And what was supposed to be a peaceful tour of the hidden beauties of Spain turned into a breaking point between two people who, not long ago, swore they were moving in the same direction. Brian spent almost an hour on the boat trying to distract himself with any thought that would take his mind off the image of his wife naked among strangers. Santiago would occasionally try to make small talk, but the mood was heavy. Brian gave short answers, keeping his eyes fixed on the horizon, pretending he was enjoying the scenery. Inside, he was restless. He tried to understand if that was really just about a beach, or if it represented something much bigger. Melissa's words kept pounding in his head. She said she felt alive, that she needed that, as if the 5 years of marriage had turned into a burden she needed to shed. And what about him? He was still there, in the same place where he believed they both belonged. Time passed, and the sky began to darken. Santiago looked at his watch and then at Brian. He said he preferred not to sail at night, that it would be better to call Melissa back. Brian nodded and went back to the trail leading to the beach. The path seemed longer this time. When he emerged from the vegetation and saw the sand ahead, he noticed that most of the people had already left. The scene felt different. The activity had ceased. Only 2 silhouettes remained in the distance, near the rocks. As he approached, his heart raced. He had a bad feeling, as if he was about to witness something he would never forget. When he got close enough to see clearly, he recognized Melissa. She was still naked, sitting on a rock, chatting with a man, also nude. They were laughing at something Brian couldn't hear. For a moment, he froze. Anger rose automatically. Melissa noticed her husband's presence and waved goodbye to the man with a friendly gesture. She walked toward Brian without showing any regret. When she stood face to face with him, she saw something different in his eyes than before. It was more than discomfort, it was indignation. He asked what kind of woman she had become. He said it was late and getting dark, that they had already agreed to return, and that she was there as if time had stopped. Melissa responded coldly. She said she was just talking. That she felt good in that place, and that the man was nice, nothing more. Brian raised his voice. He wanted to understand why she had decided to ignore everything they had agreed upon. He said she had crossed a line he hadn't even imagined existed. He asked if she had any idea of the image she was giving off, of the lack of respect that represented. She replied that she didn't belong to anyone. That she wasn't obligated to follow rules imposed by him, by a marriage, or by any old notions of right and wrong. She said she was at peace with the choices she had made that day. Brian felt as if he was being pushed out of his own life. It was as if the woman he had known was in another place, another time. They walked back in silence. She dressed before reaching the boat. Santiago noticed something had changed between them, but didn't ask questions. He simply guided the boat back, in absolute silence. Brian sat in the back and spent the journey staring at the sea, trying to absorb everything that had happened. At that moment, something inside him began to break. Disappointment had a bitter taste, and the worst part was realizing that maybe Melissa didn't see anything wrong with what had happened. Maybe she had already said goodbye to him internally, and the trip was just the means she used to finally set herself free. In the following days, the silence between Brian and Melissa took on definitive contours. Conversations were reduced to the essentials, as if every word was a risk of reopening what still hurt. Brian tried to understand what was left, if there was anything worth saving, or if everything was already decided without him being consulted. The boat ride, her exposure, the conversation with the stranger, all of it seemed like a sequence of signals that she had taken her own path, separate from the life they had built together. He couldn't pretend everything was fine. And she also didn't make an effort to ease the tension. It was as if she was waiting for him to give up on his own, as if that would spare her the guilt of being the first to leave. The most serious argument happened one morning. Brian, sitting on the bed with a tense face, asked if Melissa had any idea what she was doing to the marriage. She, standing there in a light dress, simply replied that she was tired of living a life that no longer made sense. She said they were stuck in an old idea of happiness, and that the trip had only exposed what she had been feeling for a long time. Brian tried to argue, saying that a marriage needs work, effort, good and bad phases, but she countered by saying she didn't want to keep working on something that made her feel extinguished. The argument lasted over an hour. The volume of their voices rose. He said he felt humiliated, exposed, discarded. She said he always wanted everything under control, that he suffocated her with demands he pretended were care. At the end of the conversation, Melissa picked up her bag, said she needed to breathe, and left the room without saying where she was going. Brian stayed there, looking at the closed door, with a mix of anger, frustration, and helplessness. Hours passed. The day turned into night and she still hadn't come back. He sent messages, called once, but there was no response. When she finally entered the room, it was almost midnight. She smelled faintly of alcohol and didn't explain where she had been. She just lay down and turned to the side. Brian spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what still made sense. The next morning, with their bags packed and ready to leave, Brian went downstairs while Melissa finished packing in the room. Downstairs, Santiago approached. He was hesitant, with an uneasy look. He asked for a minute of Brian's attention and said he had something important to share. Brian, surprised, listened as the guide said that the previous night, he had seen Melissa in a bar in the village. According to him, she was with a man. And they weren't just talking. They were kissing like teenagers. Santiago said he hesitated to tell, but he thought Brian deserved to know before leaving. The ground seemed to fall from under his feet. His body locked up for a few seconds while the information settled in the most vulnerable spot of his heart. At the airport, the weight of the trip finally fell. Brian confronted Melissa with the truth he carried in his chest. He asked if she had anything to say about the previous night. She looked him in the eye and said yes. She didn't hide it. She said she had gone to the bar, met the guy, and they kissed. She said she felt something different, light, without guilt. It was the same man from the beach. At that moment, Brian realized the marriage was over. There was no more sense in prolonging the conversation, or in trying to fix something that was already in ruins. That woman in front of him was no longer the same one with whom he had built a life. In silence, he took a deep breath, swallowed the pain, and looked away, choosing to leave without another word. The flight back was silent, with each one immersed in thoughts that no longer intersected. Upon arriving in the United States, Brian went home, grabbed his suitcase, packed clean clothes, and left. Melissa, sitting in the living room, didn't even ask where he was going. He didn't explain either. He just turned the key and left. Weeks later, the divorce was signed. Without dispute. Without reconciliation. Weeks after the separation, Brian tried to resume his routine, although every thought still carried traces of Melissa's presence. Memories would pop up unannounced, and on certain days it was as if she was still nearby, but in silence. He avoided asking about her, even though he had a curiosity to know how things were going from the other side. Not out of jealousy or desire for a comeback, but for a strange kind of closure his heart needed to understand the whole story. It was a mutual friend, Natalie, who broke the silence. She sent a short, straightforward message, as if she knew Brian didn't want any frills. Melissa moved to that village in Spain. She's living with a man she met during her last visit there. He read the message 3 times. Put his phone in his pocket, sat on the porch, and stared at the ground. There was something symbolic about it. She had chosen exactly the place where everything collapsed to try to start anew. It was as if she had erased the life she had with him and decided to write a new story over the old one. But Brian, at that moment, didn't feel anger. He felt relief. It seemed that now everything made sense. She had already left long before the trip. All it lacked was a destination. In the months following the separation, Melissa posted photos smiling in seaside restaurants, barefoot on the village streets, hugging her new partner, as if she had finally found what she was looking for. But behind the filtered images, reality was less enchanting. The same friend, some time later, told that Melissa was facing difficulties. The man who seemed free and charming had habits she didn't know about. He was jealous, unstable, and sometimes aggressive in his words. The village, which had once seemed charming, proved to be limiting. There was a lack of structure, a lack of routine, a lack of depth. She had traded an emotional prison for another, only this time with less security and more loneliness. In less than 6 months, Melissa returned to the United States. She arrived quietly, without fanfare, staying for a while at her sister's house until finding a place to rent. She didn't look for Brian. Nor did she apologize. She started living as if she was rebuilding herself from scratch, trying to pretend that this attempt at freedom hadn't broken her. Some people said she seemed more mature, others thought she had lost something she would never recover. But all noticed that something inside her had crumbled, and the shine that once enchanted so many people was now more dim, more contained. Brian learned of her return through the same friend. Upon hearing the news, he simply nodded in thanks. He didn't ask where she was, who she was with, or how she felt. He preferred to keep his distance. His focus was now on himself. He had resumed the habit of running on Sundays and even started volunteering to teach English classes. He was rebuilding his life without rushing, without needing to prove anything to anyone. Every achievement, no matter how small, was his. Without promises, without expectations. Just the peace of knowing he had done everything he could for someone, until the moment he understood that the greatest act of love was to let go. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.